I mean, it was a clear, conscious effort to destroy the solar and renewable energy field in the United States. And to some extent, they succeeded. As a consequence, where we led the world in all of those technologies in 1980, today we really lead the world in none of them.
Pretty sobering. Um, and I'm going to ask you this: if you could, that was really powerful. If you could succinct that into just a tighter narrative about how you felt, perhaps, on that day that you got that telephone call. Because I've heard this from other people who have served in the administration. When they got that call, that after all that work that you've done just got nixed. Could you give me an example of what that day felt like?
Well, there was one particularly stark day in the first year of the Reagan administration that summer when we learned that they were running a frontal assault on the Solar Energy Research Institute, cutting our budget by about 80%, firing about a third of the staff, laying off all of our contractors in universities and other national laboratories, two of whom went on to win Nobel Prizes. It was just absolutely brutal. I will say the worst day of my life. That affected me more deeply than the death of my parents. The fact that they came in to destroy the brightest energy prospects for the United States.
Carter said that it was the moral equivalent of war to be independent of energy. What did that actually mean during that powerful, powerful speech that he gave to the American people?
Well, it meant a lot of different things to different people. For me, what it meant was that we needed to start thinking of energy not just in terms of the traditional neoliberal, what is the appropriate price to put on externalities and how do we try to optimize that in economic terms, or not just in terms of power dynamics, who has the power to enforce the ability to get various subsidies from the federal government and who doesn't, but rather that there ought to be a vision that guides how energy is produced and used that is compatible with our vision of what we want to be as a society. It has a moral dimension to it that had basically been missing from the energy dialogue before Carter spoke.
Would you be able to say that Carter and the work that you all did should be construed today as the first Green Deal of 1979? Could that be an accurate statement?
Um, yes, the Green New Deal deals with this in terms of let me start this over. President Carter went beyond the traditional sorts of analyses that had been done of energy prior to that time, which were at the policy level almost entirely dominated by economics and by price signals, and introduced a moral dimension and a technological set of goals that is very much the same as we see in the Green New Deal. His speech was very much akin to what was released by AOC and by Ed Markey in their brief form of the Green New Deal. And what we did in the 2-year solar survey conservation study that laid out how to achieve. I'm sorry, this is getting too tangled. Let me start this thing fresh.
No worries, take your time.
Carter's speech calling for the 20% of all energy from renewables by 2000 had a certain moral clarity to it that has been largely missing from energy policy before and largely since, but has come back to us now with the Green New Deal. It involved a vision of where America wanted to go, and it was in relatively simple, straightforward terms, 20% by the year 2000, very much like the 5 or 6 page thing that AOC and Ed Markey did with the Green New Deal. And much as Jay Inslee's presidential campaign expanded that into a series of 6 position papers that spelled out how would you actually achieve these goals, we spent 2 years at the Solar Energy Research Institute and a few $1,000,000, which back then was still real money, exploring in detail how to achieve that, so that had we begun a second term in the Carter administration, we had a game plan laid out that, if implemented, I think actually could have achieved that enormously ambitious goal.
Thank you. I have heard it said by journalist Tom Hartman. He says that if Carter had gotten that second term and those policies, his ambitious policies, and the work that you all had done into that second term, it's possible we would not be dealing with climate change today. Do you think that's an accurate statement?
I think that's probably a bit of an overstatement to say we wouldn't be dealing with it. By the time that Carter was elected to the presidency, we had already accumulated a fair amount of greenhouse gas, and we were already beginning to see some natural disturbances. And to get to 20% by the year 2000 means that to get to 100%, we would have a shot at it by maybe 2025, 2030. So we would have had far less disruption than we have today when you see two major hurricanes simultaneously in the Gulf of Mexico. Right as you and I are speaking, two of the three largest forest fires in the history of California burning simultaneously. Yeah, we wouldn't have that kind of disastrous impact, but we would be having some drought, we'd be having some extreme weather. Climate change had already begun.
Thank you. Some of my independent research, and I'm also a filmmaker. I've made some films with Dr. Sylvia Earle. I've had vast interest in what's happening with the ocean. I have seen charts of ocean acidification that actually begins to spike in the 1980s. I mean, it's gradually rising for sure, but then in the 1980s, it enormously spikes. Do you think that has a correlation with Reagan's policies and how his oil policies and how much he brought oil back into the economy? Do you think there's any sort of relationship to that?
You probably ought to get a geophysicist or someone who really has taken a look at that data to comment on it. There is a lag time. Clearly, Reagan started us in a very seriously different direction. But it takes a while to lease out the lands, to get things drilled, to bring things, and to say that things that happened after 1981 were having a direct measurable impact on the world's oceans by 1988. My hunch is that if you were speaking in a 30 or 40-year time frame, for sure, but I'm dubious that it happened that quickly.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other words that you would like to say about the Carter administration and your time in that service that you could reflect on today? As I think many of us look back at that administration and go, there was a lot of honesty. There was a lot of transparency. Not perfect, perhaps, nothing ever is, but are there any lessons that we could really learn from that time right now, as we also face a very pivotal time, not specifically with the elections, but yes, and then also just the huge challenge that we're in, that our children are in? How could they learn from that?
Well, a fairly boring lesson, but a really important one, is that the president sets the moral framework for an administration. That was clearly true for Carter, and candidly, in a very different way, it was very true for Reagan. The actual implementation is done by individuals who are brought in. I mean, the president can't do everything. He can't even do most things, but what he does do, or she does do, is make the right choices for people and putting them in the correct positions. And in a number of things that are related to energy, Doug Costel at the EPA, surprisingly Jim Schlesinger at the Department of Energy, Cecil Andrus at Interior, were folks who had a great deal of courage. Schlesinger was viewed, to put it charitably, askance by the environmental community, but I actually got to know him very well and was enormously impressed. One of the things that happens when secretaries of energy deal, for example, with the oil industry, is that these are titans of industry who are used to having multi-billion-dollar corporations, of staging coups d'etat in third world countries, of having mercenary armies that will do their bidding in various parts of the world, massive crews of roughnecks. I mean, these are these are tough guys, and they are somewhat intimidating to most energy secretaries. Jim Schlesinger walked into that office, and he'd been Secretary of Defense. He'd had real armies around the world, and he'd been the head of the CIA, and he'd been the head of OMB. Um, this was a guy who was not in the least intimidated by the oil industry. One of the strange little footnotes to history, that the National Petroleum Council consists of the heads of most of the major oil companies in the United States and the Secretary of Energy and a consumer advocate. And in the earliest couple years of the Carter administration, I was the consumer advocate. So it's all these oil titans, Jim Schlesinger and me. And I was able to watch some of those interactions. And I think he was probably the toughest that we've ever had operating in that kind of intimidating environment. And he was a person who, like, I'd say the same thing for Costello, the same thing for Andrus, they listened to data and they made reasoned decisions. There was a serious effort to kill the solar photovoltaic program from the bowels of the Department of Energy, which was largely created from the remains of the Atomic Energy Commission. And in the final debate in the Secretary's office, it was my head of policy at CERI and the Undersecretary of Energy and the chief economist from the department arguing to shut down the program because solar photovoltaics just physically could never become cheap enough to be important to the nation's energy future. And Schlesinger listened to the two sides and decided to keep the program intact and to move forward. And of course, right now, this last year, solar photovoltaics made the largest contribution of energy, of any energy source, to new supply around the planet. And it's doing it cheaply. The last utility scale sale of photovoltaics is producing electricity at 1.3 cents a kilowatt hour. That would not have happened but for an appointee of the Carter administration, and one that surprised me and a lot of people with his integrity.
That's wonderful to hear. It sounds like Carter had really many amazing people in his administration. See, I have two more questions. California, under Governor Brown at the time, took a very major role, and as I understand it, was actually the kind of the star of the show internationally of the major policies and changes that were being implemented with solar and wind energy. Is there anything you could tell us about what California was achieving at that time?
Jerry Brown has always been a person who was out on the cutting edge. He had a state that was prepared to back him when he wanted to do some things that were radical. I mean, it's subject to all kinds of criticisms, the Governor Moonbeam stuff. But he didn't let that bother him. He had a great deal of confidence. He brought in Huey Johnson, once again, some superb people to run major agencies for him in this field. Brought in a very creative young guy on his personal staff named Wilson Clark, who was pushing aggressively in the solar and renewables business. And he had a couple of major utilities, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District and the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. They were prepared to be enormously innovative in a way that public utilities sometimes are, and that investor-owned utilities have much more difficulty being. And so he was in this, plus he had a legislature that was vastly more supportive than the United States Congress was in these fields. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that then and candidly all the time since, California has been like a nation apart on everything from automobile fuel efficiency standards to insulation of houses to the distribution of solar onto rooftops to moving utilities to be getting all of their new production from benign renewable resources. Hopefully we will continue in the future where California is today is where America will be 10 years from now, except with regard to forest fires.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, forest fires are certainly helping all of us rethink the past and the future as well. So maybe this is waking up more people. See, last question I have, is there anything that you would like to personally say to President Jimmy Carter? Chances are he will be watching this. They do know about the efforts. We have received letters from Jimmy Carter for the efforts we've been making the last 4 years. Is there anything that you would want to publicly say about him or about the time that you served during his administration? It is, again, his 96th birthday.
Well, I'd like to join with all of America to wish Jimmy Carter a hugely happy 96th birthday and express appreciation for the courage, the leadership, the creativity, and perhaps most important, the integrity that he brought to the presidency. As we are in a current administration that lacks all of those things, it's powerfully important to all of us Americans to look back and remember when we had a president we were really proud of.
Mr. Denis Hayes, thank you so much. And I think I can speak for my generation with the service that you've given to everyone. It's really, it's a blessing. And I know, I can imagine that it has not been easy, and just thank you.
That's very sweet of you to say, Barbara. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And yeah, I appreciate it. And yeah, all the best to you. And we'll share the video with you once we're complete. And hope that can get shared widely.
Fabulous.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes.
Take care.
You too. Thank you.